Hello young and old, welcome to Best Around. Today we're going to be looking at the game Super Castlevania 4. The game was released in Japan as Akumajor Dracula, which translates to Devil's Castle Dracula, on Halloween 1991. A few months later in the US in December 1991, and the following June in PAL regions. I had never played the game before, nor any of the NES predecessors, so I have a very fresh set of eyes for this. I want to stress before continuing that I'm mindful of these titles being very early in the lifespan of the console. It doesn't mean I mark harsher or easier, but it's more so that I understand that some things they may have done differently if the game was made even 2 or so years later. The lore is essentially that every 100 years evil forces gain a foothold and it manifests itself into Dracula, who is now stronger than ever. You, Simon Belmont, set out to defeat Dracula. At first glance, the opening visuals are great and the music always fantastic, and special mention to Simon's theme, which has to be in the very top echelon of SNES tracks. The level design was also a highlight. There are quite a few levels with vastly different backgrounds, and it does a great job at showcasing the journey that you're on. Given that the game is not particularly easy, you may well find yourself getting quite accustomed with being in the same location for a while, so at least it looks great. There's a large variety of enemies, with all sorts of different appearances and attacks, and credit must be given for the bosses. They really do look the part, and so do the standalone locations for battle. There are some really good elements here, though perhaps dissimilarly to ActRaiser, I wasn't ever really excited or pumped up when there were boss battles, as they were a bit too easy and thus the anticipation waned away some. Getting up to them could be difficult, but almost every time I arrived at a boss battle with most of my health, I ended up winning without dodging most of, or sometimes any of their attacks. The battles were at times extremely short also. The longest boss battle of the first 9 levels lasted just shy of 30 seconds, some barely lasted 10 seconds, which doesn't exactly make it seem as momentous as a boss should, given I spent longer trying to defeat wall snakes. One time it took me 14 seconds. Even some in the final boss gauntlet seemed comically easy. A couple though did take some effort, about 5 to 10 attempts, and it took a few goes to really see their pattern, which is I guess what one would hope from most bosses. The final boss seemed to have an attack which I couldn't dodge. It took me a long time to figure out how to deal with it. It was definitely a worthy opponent, and by some distance the hardest in the game. I will give credit where credit is due. The boss gauntlet was really well done, and it's definitely nice of the game creators to not be like ActRaiser and expect you to defeat them all back to back with only a set of lives for the ordeal. That would have been diabolical. These final bosses will be the main positives I remember from the game. The Mode 7 sections, for its time, must have looked absolutely spectacular. It probably is a bit more of a show of the technology as opposed to being really necessary, but I'd give extra points for the creativity. This section, with the revolving background though, is actually super easy, so it's clearly just for aesthetics. However, I in no way would fault them for wanting to show the world what they're capable of. Another example of doing things for aesthetics was the rotating room. And also, not Mode 7 this time, but in the opening level you can go into the background, which looks nice, though it never happens again, despite there being some really pretty backgrounds. The whip is a solid weapon, and Simon has a variety of different weapons such as the dagger, which has great range and is quick, the axe, which is slow but powerful and moves in an arc, the firebomb, which can burn enemies when thrown to the ground, and the boomerang, which has range, is powerful and returns back to you. Clearly the best choice among the alternate weapons. It would have been nice to be able to hold multiple sub-weapons and being able to toggle through them, but the game could be said to be looking out for you by having sub-weapons show up just before they become quite useful. Personally, I was never too into the weapons, as whenever I died I lost them, and I also only really used them sparingly throughout. The whip was plenty good for the most part. The difficulty of the game is quite high, and a key reason for that is explained later. There is definite satisfaction when you beat some of the harder levels and the harder bosses, though as mentioned earlier, it's more to do with arriving at the boss with much of your health. Only one boss out of the first 10 beat me when I had at least half of my health. Defeating bosses was the easy part generally, it's just getting up to them that is the challenge. The game will push you to improve if you persevere with it, which I definitely improved a lot. Unfortunately, this is largely where the positives end, and before I go on, I want to stress that if not for the main criticism for the controls, that this is likely a great game. Simon Belmont is a hulking figure, and he moves in a near robotic way. He trudges along, and he can't jump very high, and he is certainly impacted quite heavily by gravity, as he could barely long jump further than a child. I'd also say, given the range and speed of the whip, the other weapons didn't seem as helpful. I guess the main positive to them was that you could hit a boss from a distance whilst keeping well out of danger. I'm not sure if it's always the case, but I think that the weapons sacrifice power for range and practicality, so whilst you can hit bosses from afar, it will do less damage than the high risk, high reward whip. His movement is so stiff, there's no real fluidity to how he moves, and whilst it's said to be an improvement over previous Castlevania entries, I personally can't recall having played a much more rigid platformer on any console. The enemies are so much faster than you, and as such, this game is much more a puzzle platformer in that you need to almost see the traps and then plan ahead to avoid them for next time. You largely can't react sometimes because it's not really possible, and other times because of cheapness. Even with good controls, there's no doubt the game wouldn't be easy, but it is made so much worse with how poorly Simon moves, how inconsistent the whip is with doing damage, how gravity affects Simon, and of course the stairs. How Simon can be knocked off an edge on flat flooring at the top of stairs and then fall through the stairs. It comes across so amateur. Was this seriously their design? I'm not sure if such things are ways of inflating the difficulty or challenge, or whether they didn't have the capability to just have him land on stairs, but either way it's a horrible aspect of the game. Similarly, jumping through stairs, that is bad whether jumping onto them or jumping down through them like they don't exist. It does make things trickier and I don't fault the game for that, but certain things like this are just stupid. And same thing with ascending vertical segments, where you die from falling down from whence you came. The floor is only a few pixels out of the camera shot. There is no real reason Simon should die here. Super Mario Bros. 3 came out 3 years earlier than this, and in that game, if you fell in a vertical level, the camera followed. I know it's their design choice, but to me, it's a bit pathetic, and doesn't really make sense for your epic hero who is tasked with saving humanity to die from falling onto a floor he was just standing on. Hit detection is also a bit of a mess. With bosses, where sometimes a hit of the whip takes 1 bar, sometimes 2, it seems to alternate, so maybe 1.5 each. Sometimes they take nothing. If a hit takes only half a bar, perhaps they just need more bars, or have it get smaller, or be half coloured in, or something. Sometimes, with normal enemies, where it's like some hits don't register, or for reasons I'm not aware of, some enemies can be hit 2 times and die, and other times it takes 3 or more. I can't say I've ever seen this in any game. Hit detection with Simon is at times a little off, mostly to your detriment. It is sometimes comically bad. Lastly, using the chain as a grappling hook of sorts, it's a great idea and one I have seen implemented really well in a number of games. Somewhat strangely, it sometimes takes an extra split second for the chain to latch on, and there's also minimal to no momentum when you let go. The former can cause the most embarrassing of errors. When it comes to swinging on a fixed point, this is the worst I've ever seen it implemented. I can think of a couple of SNES games that do this so much better. However, they were around much later in the SNES lifespan, and hence had a lot more time to really optimise the available technology. It's really unfortunate, because if it wasn't for the controls, falling through stairs, camera not following you down to existing floors, and some questionable hit detection, there's really a fantastic game buried underneath these things. It does almost everything else right. What perhaps some people might not have seen in 1991, you can definitely notice the deficiencies when you compare it to some mid-90s platformers. For replayability, there is a harder second quest. I personally wouldn't bother, but like many games, it can be enjoyable to see how easily you romp through the game on a repeated playthrough. If you like the controls, I can see you really liking the game. I completed the game in about 6.5 hours. Veterans of the NES Castlevania games will likely coast through, as I hear the whip is far improved in this iteration. And also the gravity, though extreme to me, is more forgiving than in the NES games. In terms of enjoyability, I'm giving it a 6 out of 10, as despite the frustrations, there are some genuinely good passages in the game when you adjust to the existing limitations. For difficulty, I'd give it an 8 out of 10. It is largely as hard as you find the controls and as limiting as you find the rigidity of the character. Is Super Castlevania 4 a top 10 Super Nintendo game? No way. This is nowhere near it. I wouldn't have this as a top 100 game on the console, and not because it's awful, but because there are so many really good Super Nintendo games, and this just isn't one of them. I would only recommend it to those who are curious or those that really enjoyed the NES Castlevanias. Stay tuned for the next game chronologically in the series, and I'll see you all next time.